Live from SABC studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, here's what we have for you this evening.
So, can the state afford this?
If I look at the numbers, I believe we cannot afford it.
Unions are spitting fire following the minister's reiteration at a breakfast meeting this morning that the public sector's wage bill is big and unaffordable. Community activists and civil society groupings are also up in arms, saying the poor have been hung out to dry. Some economists, meanwhile, believe a lot more could have been said or explored yesterday, but wasn't. We'll also take you live to the United Nations headquarters as the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres provides an update from the world body after Russia invaded Ukraine today. The Watchdog starts now. My name is Vuyo Mvoko. Thank you for watching. A listening president. That's how people close to him often describe the president. Last year, on the 16th of June, my first guest was part of a hybrid meeting between President Cyril Ramaphosa and some of the country's young people. The meeting taking place on the back of yet another Stats SA survey that had showed that the country's unemployment rate had reached record high levels. Stellenbosch University Business School's development economist, Dr. Ntabiseng Moleko, was the first to speak as the president listened. We're going to be speaking to her in a short while to get her views on what may have she thinks may have been left out. She always has ideas on what needs to happen, more ideas, in fact, often than criticisms. And then a little later on, we'll get the country's union federations also on the finance minister's assertion, which he repeated with even more vigor today, that public service wage bill is in fact not affordable. And next month they will, of course, be having a summit over 3 days where this matter will be discussed. The minister this morning repeating with even more conviction this morning that the public service wage bill is unaffordable and must be slashed. Let's see if we do have Dr. Ntabiseng Moleko. Well, we don't have her yet, but take a listen to what the minister had to say yesterday on the issue of the public service wage bill.
Minister Kotongwana says a lot of government's money went to saving SOEs, and that money has to be redirected to the development of the economy. He said between 2013 and February this year, over 290 billion went to the SOEs bailout. Majority of government's bailout to SOEs went to Eskom. A question was asked by a student, Nosipho Funda from Manyano High School in Khayelitsha. She asked how is government going to ensure that the money given to Eskom is used appropriately.
You said yesterday that you will give Eskom 136 billion rands to pay off its debts. So what are you going to do to make sure that Eskom does pay its debts and without the money being misused?
It's a conversation, and maybe because I'm on a public platform, it's a discussion we're having with the people responsible for running Eskom. That it's important that the money that we get to Eskom, we must realize value from it. In 1998, we said we needed a split. That was a white paper of 70-30% split between public and private on a supply of the electricity. What we did not do was to create a legislative framework which allow the private sector to participate in the electricity supply industry. What has been the outcome of that? We realized that after the outages of 2008, We needed some private sector participation. Then we started in 2010, creating the environment and bringing in IPPs.
On social grants, Minister says many are incorrectly labeling him as an anti-poor. He says every time there's a crisis in the country, there are calls for more grants. Kotongwana says there has to be a way for inclusive growth so that people can participate in the economy meaningfully.
We take income support as a transition towards an inclusive growth, not make it a permanent feature of our society. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make, we tend to pile up whenever there's a problem. We think of a grant. We've got, for instance, take extended public works. We've got public employment program. We've got community development workers. We've got a whole range of these grants. Every time a problem comes, we think of a new one. I think one of the things we need to be thinking about, if really we're going to provide income support, is it not appropriate to consolidate all of this and say what is the best or optimal way of supporting or providing income support to the vulnerable?
Yesterday, Kotongwana delivered his maiden budget speech, which many hailed as a well-balanced speech. However, there are some concerns about 4.3 trillion public debt and a massive debt service cost averaging 330 billion a year. South Africans are hoping that sooner there would be light at the end of the tunnel. Velemsen Mtiane, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Our colleague Velemse, who of course was monitoring this morning's business breakfast that the Minister Kotongwana addressed. Again, going back to those issues of the public service wage bill, also addressing the issue of calls by many South Africans who are saying we need to help, people who are struggling currently, who need some form of social assistance just to be able to cope. Eskom, also a big issue at that breakfast. Many people asking him questions around that. It would seem that our gremlins have now been dealt with. The sound problem we're having with our first guest, Dr. Ntabiseng Moleko. Ntabiseng, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. I don't know what happened there, but thankfully you are back with us. Well, I was saying earlier, I mean, I remember, and we're talking earlier today, and I remember on June 16, you very fired up at that meeting, you had with several youth leaders where the president was asking what needs to be done in particular to help young South Africans who don't have work. Some of them actually have been to university, they have degrees, but can't find work. The unemployment problem seemingly is a runaway train now. It's getting worse instead of getting better. Listening to the finance minister yesterday, I'm wondering whether you had an aha moment, that finally someone is about or is getting it right, or you felt, guys, I mean, we've been talking about these things for so long, you're still not getting it. Which one was it?
I'm jailed to hope, if I can use that term. I'll always have hope for the nation. I do believe that one thing that I can definitely see, which is a light for us, is that we are seeing that envisaged Regulation 28 being utilized because of the surplus funds that we have, particularly because we always get told that there is a lack of finance, there is a lack of resources, there is a lack of capital. And in fact, that is not the case. And I think I'm grateful and I'm thankful to the minister that at least from a policy perspective, because everything around economic urgency, around agency regarding the transformation and the expansion and the stimulation of an economy comes from the policy decisions that are made. So in terms of just responding directly to your question, I am really concerned that the paradigm we are working within remains that which is not necessarily state-led development, advancing an aggressive expansion of your agricultural and industrial output, because that is what is going to absorb our unemployed South Africans that are unskilled, semi-skilled, even highly skilled into the economy. That is what is going to integrate Black-owned SMMEs, which we don't have in the large majority to participate in the national economy. That is what is going to integrate Black South Africans in townships and rural areas to participate in the national economy. So I'm encouraged because I believe that this one thing can restore our stimulus into the economy if we use it in a way that is actually going to be targeted at sectoral production, which is agriculture and manufacturing and industry, doubling our agriculture and manufacturing value add as a contribution to GDP, but also targeting those who are excluded. Remember, there are market failures that persist in the economy right now. And if you don't deal with those market failures and labor market failures, that is why you need state-led development, state interventions that the market cannot factor in and price to fix these anomalies in both the labor market and the economy. So I do want to say there was a bit of positive for everyone. I know corporates are happy, but I know that the majority of South Africans are not positive in that they may not have seen what the corporates are seeing. And I think that for too long, you are looking primarily at big business. You're looking at corporates. And I think that it hasn't changed underdevelopment, poverty, inequality. And I'll take you to facts if you would allow me. But I think that the investment-led strategy, which is driving investment up, hasn't led to diversity in the economy, hasn't led to expansion in the economy, hasn't led to new entrants into the economy. The economy we see now is pretty much what we had in 1994. Which is really starting for
in
us.
fact, to add to your very last point and taking you back at the same time to your some of your opening remarks, a lot of people have said there are some people, let me put it that way. I mean, I haven't done a scientific, look into how many people or what percentage, whether it's the majority or whatever the case may be. But a lot of people have said that the windfall is not being or has not been used optimally. They believe that it should have been invested more, in the types of areas that some of which you've mentioned, your agriculture, manufacturing, and so on, and that doesn't seem to be the case. And considering the fact that, there may not be a windfall tomorrow, so this one should have been used a lot more prudently and with a lot of strategy for it to yield the kind of maximum results.
Let me tell you, one of the things that I can concur is that definitely the tax windfall is what we call a once-off increase that is monumental, that was not expected. So it's an enhancement in the collection of tax revenue that comes primarily from an event that is a once-off event that was not necessarily from a systemic change or policy change from the state. And so you have it as a result of increase in iron ore prices, more than doubling of coal prices in the commodities market. So what you then see is that increased collection and taxes that come from those sectors, but also any other excise duties and the like that have increased the collection and thus the revenue collection of the country. I think for me, what is pivotal here is the integration and the coordination of the state in the economic cluster. And I don't really hear a lot being spoken about this. And I want to just expand on that. We had a crisis around COVID, and what we saw was that the president set up a National Command Council to coordinate all the spheres of government, to coordinate provinces, to coordinate districts, because there was a health issue health crises that affected the country. Now, we have an unemployment crisis. I won't talk to the numbers. This is pervasive. It's a gender crisis because women are higher unemployed. It's in the rural areas. It's in the townships, particularly pervasive in poverty in areas where we had former Bantustans. Some seeing more than 50% unemployment, youth unemployment over 70%, not in educational training. This is a pervasively bad situation to be in. Now, if you wanted to target interventions, you've got to coordinate the economic cluster. What you would need to see to do this kind of thing that you're talking about, targeted interventions, is to actually put the economic cluster and all of the districts, the provinces, and even the national budget in a command council where you have targeted interventions, monitor the data that comes out after every month. Why? You have a crisis. Monitor the effectiveness of the interventions. Why? You have a crisis that you need to monitor whether your interventions are having the desired result and effect, but also to monitor the efficacy of the state and its technocrats, because we do know that there's a problem of efficiencies, and you target sufficient support interventions to those areas where you're not seeing results. But you can only do this with coordination, will, and decisiveness. We have an unemployment crisis that is on the back of an economy that has led to this situation. So you've got to deal with the unemployment crisis, but really, why is the economy giving us these type of outcomes? And I think that you've got to also deal with those root problems, which are fundamentally structural. And it's primarily because of the economic structure of South Africa. We have a services-led economy. We are deindustrializing. We haven't been able to change the concentration power or the concentration index. A lot of research has been done by various institutions detailing from a sectoral position what we call the concentration index, which is quite high, where you have a few companies, very much oligopolistic structure of an economy where new entrants are unable to enter. They're excluded from a price perspective, from a competition perspective, and you really need to deal with that so that you can allow new entrants, but also open the market and remove those barriers. So if you don't deal with those structural constraints, you will continue to have these results and outcomes. And so these are the things that you really need to integrate and coordinate your planning and your policy tools so that you can deal with the fundamental problems.
But did you get a sense yesterday that things have changed for the better? The problems you and many other people have identified are actually being or are about to be dealt with. Let's take a case in point. You know what happened last year in parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, which is currently a subject of the South African Human Rights Commission hearings as we speak. We all got a sense there that cabinet ministers were supposed to know, actually didn't know. You know, and if you look at the structural reforms that we've been talking about, and you know, one helping the one or two other industries and so on, I mean, it is nothing short of a mess. You know, we're not getting, you know, all the things we were promised, or where we do, the pace is a very, very slow one. And I was listening to the minister yesterday and this morning at that breakfast where he was talking about the public wage bill. That at this point we still don't know what is wrong with the public wage bill, and I'm taking him on his word here, because he was saying, look, we don't know what the problem is. We don't know whether the problem is the numbers or problems of inefficiency. You know, we don't know that. We are hoping that when we go to the summit next month, these issues will be clear. Now, it cannot be that after all these years, when the public wage bill has been such a big issue, we can't put a finger on what it is exactly that you know is wrong with it. So it seems to me that nothing is particularly coordinated. Left hand doesn't know the right hand, and that seems to be a big part of the problem.
So you've got Vuyo to touch on the last point on coordination and how do we better this? Because that's the angle I want to look at.
Okay.
We've got to have targeted outcomes.
And Tabi saying,
that's the one.
I've got to apologize. I've got to stop you right there. I mean, there is a briefing of the United Nations on the Russia-Ukraine situation that has just started. The UN Secretary General has just started that briefing. We were told initially that it was going to run a little late, but it has just started. We're going to take you there as we speak.
It is wrong. It is against the Charter. It is unacceptable. But it is not irreversible. I repeat my appeal from last night to President Putin. Stop the military operation. Bring the troops back to Russia. We know the toll of war. With death rising, we are seeing images of fear, anguish and terror in every corner of Ukraine. People, everyday innocent people, always pay the highest price. That is why the United Nations is scaling up our humanitarian operations in and around Ukraine. Today, I'm announcing that we will immediately allocate $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to meet urgent needs. We and our humanitarian partners are committed to staying and delivering to support people in Ukraine at their time of need. United Nations staff are working on both sides of the contact line, always guided by the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity and independence. We are providing life-saving humanitarian relief to people in need, regardless of who or where they are. The protection of civilians must be priority number one. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld. The decisions of the coming days will shape our world and directly affect the lives of millions upon millions of people. In line with the Charter, it's not too late to save this generation from the scourge of war. We need peace. Thank you.
How's your relationship with Russia, Secretary General?
Thank you, sir. Sorry. Are you going to talk about the cool thing tomorrow?
We'll share with you. Well, that briefing, very brief and to the point. The UN Secretary General really doing two things. On the one hand, making an earnest appeal to Russian President Vladimir Putin to stop what started this morning. Ukrainian forces are currently battling Russian invaders on three sides after Moscow mounted an assault by land, sea and air. It's the biggest attack on a European state since World War II. Now, following Russian President Vladimir Putin's declaration of war, explosions and gunfire were heard throughout the day in Ukraine. The UN Secretary General now saying he did speak to the Russian president yesterday and made an appeal to him that what started this morning shouldn't happen. The UN Secretary General saying it's not too late to stop it, even though it did start this morning. The UN Secretary General also saying that they have put aside, I think he said, $20 million US dollars to help the people of Ukraine who may have been caught in the crossfire during this time, in the hours that this has been happening. That's the breaking story so far. He didn't take any questions. It was a few minutes long briefing. We will, of course, see what happens next. We are told that a little later on, the U.S. President, Joe Biden, will also address a media briefing to talk about what they, as the alliance that is against what Russia is doing, are prepared to to do. I understand that earlier they had a briefing to talk among themselves about what their next move or their move is going to be on the back of Russia's move. We'll continue to monitor these events and see what happens next. But a little later on, our correspondents will also be on our programs, on a program on the globe, where they will be talking about what they are seeing from their respective vantage points. So the SABC will keep you updated on this developing story. But after this short ad break, the country's union federations on the finance minister's assertion, which he repeated with even more conviction this morning, that the public service wage bill is unaffordable and must be slashed. That conversation coming up in a moment.
Pre-order the new Galaxy S22 and get free gifts including Galaxy Buds and optional Samsung Care Plus. Available from 11 March 2022.
I'm an ex-offender. I served a 10-year sentence. Prison, I require 16, 17 hours. Nekimamela radio every day. And Ukozi FM gave me hope during my hopelessness days. I'm a CEO and founder of Ukozi Solutions. Its primary focus is to deal with corruption, bribery, fraud, and theft. Imagine from prison to businesswoman/entrepreneur because of SABC Radio.
Yeah.
Well, for their respective federations' take on the government's stance on the public wage bill, please welcome Congress of South African Trade Unions Deputy President Mike Shingange and Federation of Unions of South Africa General Secretary Rifja Ajam. Good evening to both of you, and thanks very much for your time. Rifja, if I may start with you, the minister repeating it again today that clearly saying that this is a position government has taken, but of course also adding that this is going to be a subject of a big conversation that the state is going to have with organized labor and everyone else next month during that 3-day summit. Just your take, what is said yesterday and this morning.
Well, thank you for the opportunity first and foremostly. I think the minister once again is continuing the terrible trend that has been set previously by his predecessors. It is important to acknowledge that when we enter this debate, we have to focus on the narrative that South Africa is in a process of transformation. South Africa is in a process of embracing the principle of becoming a capable and a competent state. And you are unable to do that without the skilled personnel that reside within the public service. So we have to approach the debate and the discussion with an open mind. We have to look at lasting and tangible solutions, and we have to dispel this narrative that the public service or the public sector is bloated. So as much as the minister is attempting to bring about these austerity narratives and wanting to manage this particular process, we equally appeal to the minister that during the upcoming public service summit, we will be engaging from a meaningful perspective, and we expect nothing less from the minister. During times of the pandemic, during times of emergencies, it has now been proven with absolute conviction that the public sector skilled personnel have come through again and again and again. So it is absolutely despicable that the public servants have to be the scapegoat of what has been, as we all know, the undertones of corruption and many other elements that we have brought to their attention time and time again. So we are hoping that at the upcoming summit, there will be a meeting of minds to be able to resolve this matter.
From what has been said so far, do you believe that government is approaching this with, as you call it, an open mind? And I'm saying this also, I mean, on the back of, them deciding, not to implement, the last part of the last wage, 3-year wage agreement.
Definitely not. Definitely not. When you take into account that you renege on the latter part of a multi-term agreement, after you openly embrace the fact that there will be stability, after you openly embrace the fact that you yourself as government, as employer, welcome the setting of these type of agreements which are legally binding by nature, how then does it pose any form of credibility on the side of government when we know full well they have equally contributed to what they perceive to be bloatedness at the time of the former administrations? So it is disingenuous to be able to continue to fuel the narrative when they have erred on the side of now challenging openly an attack. Well, not challenging, but they are in essence fueling this attack on collective bargaining. You are undermining every element of this particular process, and it is simply one that we will not leave unchallenged, and that speaks volumes in terms of our legal action that has been taken up to the Concourt.
To what extent, as organized labor, are you united and, in fact, talking to one another? In other words, being deliberate about what may or needs to happen over the next month, because one would imagine that the unity of the workers is going to be a big plus in your efforts to really make sure that workers are not shortchanged or, as you put it, made scapegoats for a host of other things.
If ever there was a time that organized labor under the banner of the public sector unions and their respective federations have displayed unconditionally unity, it is now. It is now, during the time of the pandemic, that the public servants were dealt the harshest of blows, yet they were expected to feel the front lines. So whether it is teaching, whether it is the medical profession, whether it is policing, we are standing in unison on this matter, because ultimately we do not want, any form of indifference or division to be used as a point of inflection that will advance the interests of that agenda that they are setting now. So as the two caucuses within the PSCBC, we are definitely standing shoulder to shoulder on this matter.
And very, very quickly, and I'm raising this because you've just mentioned the frontline workers who carried the nation through a very difficult time during this pandemic. The minister made pronouncements yesterday about how workers' health and education workers in particular are going to be compensated. Are you happy with what he had to say? Does it go far enough?
Well, if you take into account, the 2020 settlement that goes unremunerated at this stage. How can it ever be enough when you take into account the inflationary increases that have come about? How do you even begin to justify the rising costs of food and fuel, albeit the Eskom crisis at this stage? So remuneration is one thing, but what government needs to understand and what they need to take into cognizance in terms of real terms is that they will be suffering a brain drain. They will be losing these skilled personnel to the likes of the UAE. We are already seeing it in many other sectors. And what equally places further burden and pressure on the system, Vuyo, is that we are not even beginning to understand the critical unfilled posts within the system. Right now, as we take a look at the Presidential Health Summit that convened in 2018, already at the time you had 57,000 vacant posts within that sector. Now, as you move forward, the 2020 Human Resources for Health strategy spoke about 97,000 additional posts that have to be created within the ambit of health workers to be able to deal with the 2025 projections in terms of chronic human resources. So how is government even going to move the goalposts when your crucial resources are held at ransom, when they are not being rewarded for the loyalty that they had displayed over this time? So there are many facets that we take into account, and we are even prepared to be engaging on the issue of the professionalization of the public service. So we are putting many cards on the table, and we expect government to come with the same kind of vein, to come with the same courtesy to be able to drive South Africa in being not only a capable but a competent developmental state. Without that, we are going to be failing dismally.
Mike Shinganga, let me bring you in. Apologies, I don't know what happened there, but I'm glad you are back. Just your response first to the pronouncements made by the minister, saying we should all be grateful as a nation for what health workers did during this pandemic, and also for what teachers have had to put up with, and hence partly as a token of appreciation, some money has been set aside for this budget to try and compensate them for a job well done.
Thank you very much, Fu, and thanks for having us. Look, we have been on record that it's not enough for government to give a token of appreciation only in the word of mouth, because these healthcare workers, they have watched their colleagues die during the pandemic. There were not enough staff before the pandemic. They are less than they were after pandemic because their colleagues have passed on. They are traumatized, they are anxious, they are afraid of COVID themselves. They started this fight against COVID with not proper protection and also training. But not only that, they had to be demoralized because as part of the greater battalion of the public servants, they could not get their salary increase. They are underpaid now. They are doing a job for whole lot of people. So government will have to do a whole lot more than just to say on behalf of the nation, they are actually grateful that they did what they did. I'm sure we'll have listened to our teachers saying on earlier this morning that much as there are these billions that have been added now to education, it doesn't go far enough to cover what was cut in the past three budget speeches. It doesn't cover that. It's only covered by at least 1 or 2 billions. So a lot still needs to be done in terms of infrastructure, in terms of making sure that there are more teachers that actually can stand in front of our kids. So our view is that it's fine and well and good to say to the nation that you are grateful for what these frontline workers have done, but it's another thing to incentivize them. It's another thing to motivate them. It's another thing to make them feel that you value what their sacrifice is.
Well, if you think what is being done now is not enough, it's probably going to get worse. You heard him yesterday, and I'm sure you heard him again this morning. Government's position is that the public sector wage bill is big and simply unaffordable.
Well, we had that, particularly today, because yesterday I don't think he had that guts enough to pronounce that. I'm sure he was addressing different constituencies. So I'm sure today he was emboldened enough to repeat what those who came before him have always been repeating. But like we've always done when they were saying the public sector is bloated. We have proven that in terms of head count, that is not correct. We are going to prove, if they are prepared to engage with us, that in fact it's not even correct that the public sector wage bill is too high, or at least the public servants are paid high. And Vuyo, let me address one of the things that he raised yesterday about the upcoming public sector summit, and saying to the nation that he hopes and he thinks that that summit is going to address this thing of the public sector wage bill. Clearly, that public sector summit is not meant for collective bargaining. The collective bargaining institutions remains intact. We are inviting government to come to the collective bargaining structures to engage with the parties being labor there. In the public sector summit, we're going to engage the policy positions of the state, how to transform the state, how to have a single public service, but also to deal with the remuneration policy. We want government to be clear in that summit, to tell us when they say a nurse in South Africa is overpaid, if they're saying a teacher in South Africa is overpaid, who are they comparing them with? Are they comparing them to a nurse in Canada? And if that is the case, why are nurses in South Africa going to Canada or Britain? Are they comparing the nurse in South Africa to a private sector? If that is the case, why are nurses in South Africa moonlighting? Why are they leaving the public sector to go and work in private if the public sector is paying unacceptably high? We want them to, once and for all, to clarify what we call a remuneration policy, because we don't understand this notion that is fed to the nation that we are overly paid. It is bloated. It is bloated in terms of what? In terms of the frontline workers, in terms of the service, people who are in the coalface of service delivery.
Okay, Mike.
We're not going to bargain.
Okay, Mike,
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to hold your thoughts right there. And Rifsha as well, I'm going to ask you to just stay put. We're going to take you to the U.S., where President Joe Biden just convened a White House Situation Room meeting with his national security to discuss events in Ukraine. Let's hear what he has to say.
Through dialogue to avoid needless conflict and avert human suffering. For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen. And now it's unfolding largely as we predicted. In the past week, we've seen shelling increase in the Donbass, a region in eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. The Russian government has perpetrated cyber attacks against Ukraine. We saw a staged political theater in Moscow, outlandish and baseless claims that Ukraine was about to invade and launch a war against Russia, that Ukraine was prepared to use chemical weapons, that Ukraine committed a genocide. Without any evidence, we saw a flagrant violation of international law in attempting to unilaterally create two new so-called republics on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And at the very moment that the United Nations Security Council was meeting to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty, to stave off invasion, Putin declared his war. Within moments, missile strikes began to fall on historic cities across Ukraine. Then came the air raids, followed by tanks and troops rolling in. We've been transparent with the world. We've shared declassified evidence about Russia's plans and cyber attacks and false pretexts so that there could be no confusion or cover-up about what Putin was doing. Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. And I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response. I just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning, and we're in full and total agreement. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. This includes VTB, the second largest bank in Russia, which has $250 billion in assets. As promised, we're also adding the names to the list of Russian elites and their family members that we're sanctioning as well. As I said on Tuesday, these are people who personally gain from the Kremlin's policies, and they should share in the pain. We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead. On Tuesday, we stopped the Russian government from raising money from U.S. or European investors. Now we're going to apply the same restrictions to Russia's largest state-owned enterprises, companies with assets that exceed $1.4 trillion. Some of the most powerful impacts of our actions will come over time as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It will strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions. And we're preparing to do more. In addition to the economic penalties we're imposing, we're also taking steps to defend our NATO allies, particularly in the East. Tomorrow, NATO will convene a summit. We'll be there to bring together the leaders of 30 allied nations and close partners to affirm our solidarity and to map out the next steps we will take to further strengthen all aspects of our NATO alliance. Although we provided over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again. Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. Over the past few weeks, I ordered thousands of additional forces to Germany and Poland as part of our commitment to NATO. On Tuesday, in response to Russia's aggressive action, including its troop presence in Belarus and the Black Sea, I've authorized the deployment of ground and air forces already stationed in Europe to NATO's eastern flank allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Our allies have also been stepping up, adding the other allies, the rest of NATO, adding their own forces and capabilities to ensure collective defense. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal, to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil-producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy-consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden their cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them, but the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence. They've repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine, and may God protect our troops.
Mr. President.
Associated Press, Zeke.
So do you have any plans to speak with President Putin at this point?
Well, U.S. President Joe Biden giving a media briefing there, updating journalists on decisions that he has taken. If you missed it, they're freezing assets of people who he says have been prompting up, supporting, or have benefited from decisions and policies of Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying those people are really going to be dealt with. They are going to stop them from benefiting further. They are also saying Russian SOEs are also going to be squeezed. I think squeeze was the word he used, to make sure that they don't have access to finance or technology that furthers their ambitions. But President Biden saying that they are not going to go as the United States and defend or fight in Ukraine, but will form part and support NATO's initiative. NATO are going to meet over the next day to decide what happens next. Earlier, we did bring you the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who made two important announcements. One was that he has made yet another appeal to President Putin to stop what happened or what started happening this morning. Secondly, saying the United Nations is also going to help ordinary people in Ukraine who have been caught or who are being caught in the crossfire. This is a developing story. Our sister program, The Globe, which is coming up next, will bring you all the details. From the Watchdog crew, it's a good night.